Hi, I'm Debonee Morgan. Welcome to the Spirit of Now Zeitgeist podcast, where we talk to people who have been influential in spiritual lives of people who are spiritually independent. Today we have with us Sean Murphy, a fully authorized Zen teacher. We like to call him Sensei Sean, in the American White Plum Zen lineage with over 30 years of Zen training experience, as well as a 2018 National Endowment of the Arts Creative Writing Fellow. His One Bird, One Stone, 108 Contemporary Zen Stories won the 2014 International Book Award in the Eastern Religions category. He's the award-winning author of 3 novels with Bantam Dell Books, receiving the Hemingway Award for first novel for his The Hope Valley Hubcap King, and the 2009 National Press Women's Communication Award for Best Novel, The Time of the New Weather, and the 2017 William Faulkner Wisdom Award for Novel in Progress for his current project, Wilson's Way. He is the founder of the nonprofit Sage Institute for Creativity and Consciousness, which hosts an innovative meditation leaders training program. He teaches writing and meditation at the University of New Mexico, Taos. Now, I can say, because I have read the nonfiction books, that they are amazing and funny, which is relevant to our conversation today. So welcome, Sean. We're so glad to have you.
Yeah, great to be here, Debonee. Thank you.
So as I was saying, your books are funny. They're wise, but they're also funny. And so today I thought, who better to talk about humor and levity than a sensei? I think so many people think of Buddhism as something that is heavy and profound and takes commitment and maybe austerity, and it just kind of has a heavy feel, I think, for some people who may not be close to it. So, my first question is there room for levity in spirituality? Is there room for humor?
Oh boy, I wouldn't have devoted 30 years to practice if there wasn't a sense of humor in it. It was one of the first things that drew me to the Zen tradition is there's a iconoclastic kind of stance with it, which often involves humor, and there's always room for humor to make light of such a deep and heavy practice. It's the leavening agent that it needs, and the way Zen started was Buddhism joined with Taoism in China, and Taoism has a healthy mixture of this kind of view of human folly, which has a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek element to it. And the way the stories about Zen go, it's said that Buddhism had kind of hardened up and become very serious 1,000 years or so after the death of its founder. This was about 500 AD in China, and Zen arose partly out of wanting to puncture the sanctimonious, and overly reverential and kind of ossified a feeling that was starting to creep into the original Buddhist teachings. So
that's interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So it begins with this sense of, let's just toss things on their ear a little bit. So there's this thread of crazy wisdom and the holy fool that runs through Zen, it's part of what made it attractive to me in the first place. I don't think I could practice in a tradition that it didn't have a sense of humor.
Since the humor piece was attractive, how did you make a commitment to the path?
Yeah, well, I remember running across one of the first stories that I ran across was in a book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones by Paul Reps, and a collection of Zen stories. And there's a traditional story that caught my eye immediately and made me wonder about this tradition when I was in college in my 20s, I think, when I read it. And it's a story many people have heard. This learned professor comes to Japan in, maybe sometime in the 1800s or something, and wants to learn about Zen from this distinguished, well-known Zen master. And they sit down together, and of course it's Japan, it's Zen, there's always tea, and so they've got a pot of tea brewing, and the professor immediately starts to ask all these philosophical questions about Zen, and starts to, in the middle of it, slip in how much he knows about the history of Buddhism and the history of Zen and what years everything happened and what the names of the great masters were and all of this. And so the Roshi, the Zen master, is saying, "Oh, very interesting, very interesting. You know so much about Zen." And he begins to pour a cup of tea for the professor. And the tea reaches the top of the cup, and then the master keeps pouring. It starts to flow over the sides of the cup, and the professor's watching for a minute, wondering, "Can I say anything about this? Is this a mistake? What is this?" And then finally, he can't contain himself anymore, and he says, "Roshi, the cup's too full. It's running over." And the Roshi says, "That's the way your knowledge has presented itself to me. And you'd have no room for me to pour anything new in. You have to empty your cup before you can receive any real teaching." And so, it's quietly humorous. And I just thought, wow, a tradition where a teacher would use that kind of method, rather than trying to explain to the professor that, that he's kind of too full of himself. What a great way, just demonstrate it that way. And when I started to explore the tradition for myself, there's, sometimes things when they happen aren't so funny,
Right.
but afterwards you realize there's kind of a cosmic joke being played on you. And I feel like probably a lot of us have felt that way. My coming to serious Zen practice, there's a story about that again, I find funny in retrospect. I started practicing in the late 80s, and I was still basically coming at it with a hippie attitude. I thought Zen, we're just going to chill out, and I wasn't quite prepared for the rigor of the practice. I mean, the hours and hours of sitting meditation and the discipline that is required. And I started practicing at the Zen Center of Los Angeles, which had been going for a long time and had a fairly relaxed feel at the time. But I met a couple of visiting monks from a monastery back east, and I was very impressed with them. They were just passing through, and they invited me to come visit Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York next time I was back east. And at that point, I used to go back east to caretake some property in Maine in the summers. And so I thought, oh, well, next time I'm out there, I'll drop in and see them. And so I dropped into this Zen Mountain Monastery, which had quite a rigorous feel, and a community that involved some very committed resident monastics with shaved heads and the robes and the whole thing. It was just a lot more of a monastic, very disciplined, kind of Japanesey looking traditional samurai feel to this place, and I just thought, cool, well, okay, I'm interested in this. And we were sitting the morning. I was just supposed to be there for a day and a half or something, a couple of days. And we're sitting there the first morning, and there's this tradition in Zen where you meet with the teacher and you're called for private interviews with the teacher. It's called, technical term is dokusan. And I was sitting there, and as a visitor, I didn't realize I would be called up first for the meeting with the teacher. And these private interviews with the teacher, they have a reputation for being a little bit daunting. The teacher will kind of probe you to test what kind of insight you have or whatever. And, I was at this point very early in my practice where I was still nervous about these kinds of encounters. And I'd heard that the teacher at Zen Mountain Monastery, who I later became very close to, John Daido Lori, became my primary teacher for many years. I heard that he could be a rather imposing figure. And anyway, so I'm sitting in silence in the monastic hall, and there's 30 or 40 people sitting. And then the monitor, who's in charge of these things, calls out, makes the call for interview dokusan with the teacher, and says, the dokusan line is now open. First to anyone visiting from out of town. I thought, oh, that's me. And so the place I'd practiced a few times, Zen Center of Los Angeles, had this relaxed atmosphere. So I got up in a relaxed way. I was using a sitting bench at the time. And I began to fold up my sitting bench. And I'd already noticed that if somebody moved in the Zendo that morning, so one of the monitors or one of the monks would shout, "Sit still," or if somebody was nodding out, they'd shout, "Wake up." And I thought, oh, this is kind of intense. I don't know. It's shouting during meditation. I don't know if I like this. But anyway, I still felt, I was accustomed to doing things a certain way. So I got up slowly, was folding up my sitting bench, and the monitor, to my surprise, shouts at me, "Move quickly." And so I kind of jumped, and I realized I didn't know where to move quickly to. There was a line, in Zen centers, there's a line where you line up in sitting meditation position to go see the teacher. And I didn't know where that line was. And I'm looking around the meditation hall, and I see a strip of carpet at the back of the meditation hall. And so I'm thinking, okay, that must be it. So I run over there and sit down. And then they call the rest of anyone else who's going to come see the teacher that morning. The hall just erupts. All these people start running and everything, all the usual people who practice there. I thought, wow, they're all running swiftly. I didn't realize at the time there's a Japanese tradition of showing eagerness to go to see the teacher, and I hadn't shown the requisite eagerness. So, of course, I've just been shouted at. I've just been placed at the front of the line to meet the teacher, and I'm sitting there, my heart's pounding because my adrenaline was going, and all these people are piling in behind me, who are going to go see the teacher after me. And then I look around and I realize I don't know what door you go through to see the teacher. Yeah, I could see, I was in the back of the meditation hall. I could actually see 3 doors, and I didn't know where the teacher's room was. And there's a protocol that I did know from my other center, which is you do 3 full bows to the floor, 3 full prostrations when you're going to see the teacher. 1 outside the door, 1 in front of the teacher when you're inside, and then 1 as you're leaving, the other students coming in. But I'd never been first in line. So anytime I'd gone in to see the teacher before, there'd been someone else coming out, and you bow together. So I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know what door to go through. There's 3 doors I can see. Nobody's told me. And also, I've never been first in. So what do? There's not another student coming out. Do you still bow before the door? And I've been shouted at, my adrenaline's going. And you're waiting to hear the teacher's bell, which is a little bell they ring, and it's a signal to that you're supposed to go then. I'm just sitting there dreading that, hearing that bell. And sure enough, all of a sudden, I hear the bell, and I jump to my feet, I grab my sitting bench, and I kind of freeze for a moment because there's still 3 doors, and I don't know which one. I think, okay, it's Zen, when in doubt, bow. So I just ran to one of the doors, and I just did a full bow in front of it. And the same monitor inside the Zendo saw me doing that, and he just shouted, "No, no, 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 no." He shouts to the timekeeper, "Oh, go help him." And the timekeeper jumps up, runs over, basically physically grabs me, carries me through that door, which was just a swinging door, to an interior door, which is where the teacher's door actually was. And he opens the teacher's door and basically just flings me through it. And so I'm there in front of John Didolori, who's this, one of the few American teachers at the time, and the room's darkened, and he's a very imposing figure with a shaved head and robes and everything. I could hardly even speak. Had been so upset and offended, actually, by the whole thing. Of course, a lot of times when I say a cosmic joke is being played upon you, it means your ego is being subverted. And the whole setup in Zen with going to see the teacher is meant to activate your ego. So if you're feeling offended, you can be sure that your ego's been activated, right? So I'm feeling offended. Right. I'm feeling upset. I can't even think of anything intelligent to say to the teacher. And all I really remember about that encounter is within a few short moments, he rang his bell again, at which point I was supposed to leave. So I go back to the Zen hall, and I'm sitting in meditation while the other people are going in, and I'm just sitting there fuming. I'm supposed to meditate, and I'm just thinking, what is this Nazi Zen? It's like, I thought we were going to chill out. I thought, where's the compassion? Where's the wisdom? Everyone's shouting at each other. So after the morning sitting was over, I was supposed to stay for the whole day, but I just thought, screw it, I'm getting out of here. And I went up to the dormitory room where I'd stayed, and I quickly packed up my backpack and sleeping bag. I thought, I'm just getting out of here. And the monastery is a big place. There's 3 or 4 floors, and it's a little bit maze-like. And so I grab my pack and I walk out of the dormitory room into the hallway. And again, there's doors on each end of the hall, and I don't really know which one leads to the stairway that takes you out of the building. So I just think, okay, tiptoe over to the door, open it up, and sure enough, there's a stairwell there. And I think, okay, I'm out of here. And I go down the stairs, and then I realize on every landing there's a door, and I don't know which door goes out to the outside and which, so I'm just thinking, okay, I just grab a likely looking door and swing it open, thinking I'm escaping. And instead of it being the door to the outside and a clear escape route to my car, I open the door to the inner office, and I walk in, and there's the head monk is sitting there, and I walk in with my backpack, and he looks up at me and with this really piercing gaze, and then he just kind of melts open, and he says, "Oh, you have to leave so soon. It's been so wonderful to have you here." And he comes up, and just like radiating pure love, he gives me this giant hug, and I'm muttering something about, yeah, something came up and I have to leave. I couldn't get out of it at that point, but so we say goodbye, and he says, "I hope you'll come visit us again soon. It's been so great to have you here." And then he shows me the actual door, and I leave. I couldn't kind of get out of leaving at that point, but as I drove away, I was so confused because how do I reconcile this, this feeling like everything was just too intense and rough and rude, with the fact that this person had just greeted me with, I'd never seen such radiance in a person, and perfect love, and embraced me. So, that's one of those kinds of stories of the universe. I felt like the universe played a joke on me. If I'd managed to walk out the correct door, I would have gotten in the car and gone away and never come back, And, but since I walked through the wrong door, kind of a cosmic joke, and was met with that kind of really beautiful, obviously unconditional love, I just thought, oh, geez, I guess I'm going to have to come back. And sure enough, that's the practice center where I spent most of my time in serious practice in years to come. So,
isn't that interesting? And that's one of the things that I love about humor is it's subversive. In what is getting subverted is your ego, like you said.
Right, exactly.
When you're offended, there's, what part of you gets offended? It's only your ego, right?
That's right. And the whole thing, of course, came back to, how am I being perceived by these people? How do I think that a person like me ought to be treated? How do I think things should be done? Of course, I didn't like being placed at a disadvantage and being shouted out in the meditation hall, and everybody, one imagines people will be thinking poorly of you. But the funny thing is when I soon after that enrolled in a graduate program at the Naropa Institute, which is the Buddhist influenced college, which has a really well-known writing program. I was getting an MFA in writing. The first summer I was at Naropa Institute, we're supposed to be assigned to, we're supposed to choose a visiting teacher to assign ourselves to as kind of a TA. And John Didolori, who was the resident teacher at the monastery where I'd had that whole series of experiences, and the teacher who I'd faced in the interview room and hadn't been able to say hardly a word because I was so, befuddled by everything that happened. It turned out he was going to be there to teach for 2 weeks. So I signed up to be I thought, okay, I'm scared of this guy. I'm intimidated. I guess I'll just sign up to be his TA and just try it on. And as it happened, we were interested in a lot of the same things. And after a few days, any sense of intimidation or anything broke down, and we really became good friends. And talking about everything from Zen to art to practice. And so I became his formal student for the next 17 years, spent a lot of time at the monastery. But he was a great storyteller, and his stories about his own Zen practice were a lot of what inspired me to do my book of Zen stories, One Bird, One Stone, based on Zen teachers and students in practicing in the West, practicing in the United States and Europe, which at that point had been going on for maybe 50 years, 40, 50 years. Most of the traditional books of Zen stories, there is quite a tradition of that, but most of them are drawn from Eastern sources, ancient Chinese and Japanese masters. But Daido's stories were so vivid and so much fun, really, and a lot of them were so funny that I thought, boy, someone should do a book of stories from people teaching here in the West. And I thought, well, maybe I should do it. And Daido was very supportive of it. But so that it's kind of a cosmic joke that got me deep into the practice in the first place, is the way I look back at it.
Yeah. The cosmic joke on me was when you and I first met in Santa Fe that time, and I got a couple of your books. I said to myself, well, gee, now I just have to have time to read these. And I had a flight that was supposed to take off at 6 a.m. the next morning. And long story short, it took me almost 2 days to get from Santa Fe to Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
And I finished 2 novels in that time.
Oh, wow. Great.
So the universe gave me the time that I needed, just not in the way that I expected.
It's funny. Sometimes I'm renowned among my friends and family for having a poor sense of direction. So me running about the monastery in and out of the wrong doors is almost like a French farce, but it's so, it's so fitting that my foible of having a bad sense of direction, is what led me in the right direction, It's and so often, William Blake, the well-known English poet, it's very quotable, isn't he? But I just ran across a quote by him that said, any fool who persists in folly will eventually become wise. So
that's so perfect. That's so perfect.
Yeah, so you could say my story of the Zen practice over 30 plus years is I persisted in my folly. I don't know if I've quite attained wisdom yet, but anyway, I'm working that way,
And now that you mentioned that, my original question is there room for humor in very serious spirituality? Yeah. And I guess you could turn that on its head, which is frequently what humor is, and ask the question, how could anybody achieve very deep spirituality without having a sense of humor?
Sure.
The thing that keeps us rigid is the ego, right?
Right. Yeah, and humor is about subverting our expectations. We think things are going to run one way, and they run the other way, and of course, it's our ego that's trying to control things and predict how things are going to go. And humor subverts our expectations. And life has a tragic dimension and it has a comic dimension. And without the comic dimension to leaven the tragedy, oh boy, I don't know where we'd be. Again, oftentimes the things that are funny to us in retrospect are not necessarily funny when they're happening, but then they're the stories we tell over and over again, aren't they? One of the first stories that Daido, John Daido Loori, my longtime Zen teacher, told me that inspired me to write the book One Bird, One Stone and collect other stories was he was a monk at the Zen Center of Los Angeles with Maezumi Roshi, some decades before I'd started practicing. And he worked there and he was kind of a central figure there. And he was very close to his teacher, Maezumi Roshi. And after a few years of his own practice, he was feeling a little full of himself one day, I guess. And he said to Maezumi Roshi, I think I've really finally clarified the matter of life and death. And Maezumi said, oh, is that so? And Daido said, I really think I'm getting it. And Maezumi said, you've clarified the matter of life and death, have you? And Daido said, yeah, I think I'm really at peace with it. And with that, Maezumi threw himself violently upon Daido, knocked him to the ground and began to strangle him. And at first Daido's, frozen, and then he can't breathe. So he starts trying to say, Roshi, what's going on? Tries to push him while Roshi won't let go of his throat. And finally, Daido the only way he can get him off him is he just wails at him with his fist and hits his teacher and knocks him off. And Maezumi gets up because it's kind of brushing off his hands and says, "So you've clarified the matter of life and death, have you?" and so Daido gets up, brushes himself off, and a little bit later he's walking through one of the halls of the meditation center, and he passes another of the senior monks, and the senior monk does a double take because he sees the marks of Maezumi's fingers upon Daido's throat. And he stops, he looks at Daido and goes, "Oh no, you didn't say to Roshi that you'd clarified the matter of life and death, did you?" So clearly the same thing had happened to others. This was a stock thing that Maezumi would do to show that, well, if you really clarified the matter of life and death, why are you fighting so hard to breathe, So, of course, this is not, nobody ever did anything that extreme to me. Those kinds of moments, there's stories of them all through Zen, but, they have to do with a certain kind of response being the right response for that moment between that student and that teacher, and again, it's like pouring the cup of tea until the cup runs over. It's demonstrating something rather than explaining it, which is a big deal in Zen to demonstrate, often through something that seems unconventional or even a little bit crazy.
Well, and it's experiential, right? These stories are, you experience it rather than, integrate it intellectually, right?
Right. And and it's very practical and it's very visceral. If you can't breathe, then you understand how deep your attachment to life is, right? You're going to fight like hell to get that breath into you. So,
yeah, absolutely. We're talking a lot about Zen, but how does the idea of humor show up in other traditions or archetypes that go across spiritual paradigms?
Yeah, well, it's there's certain traditions that are more drawn to it than others, and often it's like Zen's a particular branch of Buddhism that happens to value those kinds of crazy wisdom methods or those kind of unconventional or eccentric behaviors. Right. So in the Islamic tradition, there's Sufism, which has a great fondness for poking fun at human foibles, and it has this great fondness for this holy fool archetype and the kind of crazy wisdom, unconventional or eccentric means of pointing to the truth. And so, I'm very fond of the stories of the holy fool Nasruddin in the Sufi tradition. There's so many stories about how his seemingly absurd behavior is well, sometimes it's just absurd and sometimes it's concealing wisdom. So Nasruddin, he's a legendary figure, and who knows whether he really lived or how many of these stories that are attributed to him really, have just been made up afterwards. But there's one I like where Nasruddin is in the marketplace being a beggar, which is apparently is how he spent part of his life, at least in legend. And it became known that this man who was the beggar, Nasruddin, was a real idiot. And if you offered him 2 coins, a higher value coin and a lower value coin, he'd always accept the lower value coin. And so everybody gets interested, and they start going up to this guy to offer him 2 coins, and he always accepts the smaller coin. And finally, somebody who knows him and knows that he's kind of pulling a gag on people goes up to him and says, "Nasruddin, why, when people offer you money, you always take the smaller coin?" And he said, "Well, look how much money I made by accepting these smaller coins. If I accepted the higher value coin, nobody would give me any money, So he's, by apparently behaving like the fool, he's attracted this kind of interest. There's a traditional Zen story that's something like that. There's this fool of a fisherman who, where all the other fishermen are out there fishing with a bent barbed hook to catch the fish, this man uses, instead of a hook, he uses a straight needle on his fishing rod, and he drops it in the river, and he never catches any fish, and everybody thinks the man's an idiot. And And so this starts to arouse curiosity, and all sorts of people come and start talking to this fisherman who instead of fishing with the bent hook, fishes with the straight hook. And finally, the story gets all the way to the ear of the emperor, who's so intrigued he can't help but come to visit to see this idiot of a fisherman. And he comes with his whole entourage, and there's the fisherman on the bank of the river, fishing with his silly hook. And the emperor goes, "Fisherman, how is it that you're using a straight hook instead of a bent hook to fish with? What on earth can you be fishing for?" And the fisherman turns to the emperor and says, "Well, I've been fishing for you, emperor." So the only way he could ever get the emperor to come see him would be by behaving like a fool, So
yeah.
So there's a lot of, what we think is wise in the world isn't always wise, and what we think is foolish isn't always foolish. And people who are very full of themselves and full of sanctimony and apparent learnedness are often the people who are the targets of these kinds of stories, because of course the ego can take hold of anything. So you become a religious figure, your ego is very likely, if you take yourself too seriously, to take hold of that. And you think now you think you're a great teacher, or you're an enlightened person, or something like that. And so these kind of traditions are full of these stories where somebody's ego is subverted. And in the Chinese Zen story, in this case, it's like the emperor's. The emperor is slightly made a fool of by this fool of a fisherman.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and it makes me think of the Western story of the emperor's new clothes.
Exactly.
And,
yeah.
It has to be a young child that points it out.
Right. It has to be somebody who's so innocent, because everybody else is so caught up in the ego trip of supporting the emperor's bizarre idea that he's wearing the finest suit of clothes in the world when he's actually walking naked. But it takes a child to see the truth. It takes a holy fool to see the truth. There's all sorts of stories in Zen about people who tried too hard and took themselves too seriously. Of course, like my story at the monastery shows, practice is taken very seriously, but discipline is taken very seriously. But I forget which famous story it is of somebody who became a great master, practiced and practiced and practiced. The most diligent person in the monastery, the most serious person in the monastery, practiced and practiced, performed austerities, refused all pleasures, sat all through the night, didn't sleep, didn't eat, wanted enlightenment more than anything else. Of course, in those days, you could join the monastery when you were 10 years old or 12 years old. So, after 20 years of this, the monk's still a young man, and he just goes, "Screw this. I've been devoted, I've been devoting myself to this so seriously for all these years, and I've been missing out on all of life's pleasures, and screw this." So he finds a ladder and he climbs over the monastery wall, and he's somehow saved up a few coins. He goes, "Screw it, I'm going to a brothel." And he goes to a brothel, and so the story goes, at the moment that he achieves climax with one of the ladies at the brothel, all of a sudden he's enlightened. So that's how he becomes the great master, is by giving it all up. And so there's all sorts of stories like that, where you try and you try and you try and you try, and finally you give up, or finally life plays a joke on you, or it takes something to puncture how serious you're being, how sanctimonious you're being, how seriously you're taking yourself.
Right. Well, and it's non-dual, and it's that balance thing, right?
Right.
If he just spent his whole life in a brothel, he wouldn't be enlightened.
Of course not.
It was the letting go of the other, but it was letting both be at the same time.
Exactly.
To be serious, to be committed, to be to care about the result, and also to let it go, to not become attached to it, to not cling to it, and to find that balance and let that both things be true at the same time.
Right. Yeah, there's that famous story that comes from somewhere in Christianity of oh, it's told in so many different versions, and it's been updated for the 21st century. But it's the story about, a lot of us have heard it, I'm sure. There's a very devout man of God who's in a flood, and a giant flood comes and engulfs his house, and he climbs up to the second story, and the flood engulfs the second story, and he climbs up to the attic, and the flood engulfs there, and finally climbs up to the roof. And rescue team comes in a boat and says, "Come on, get in the boat. We're getting you out of here." And the man goes, "No, I'm waiting for God to send me, save me. I'm waiting for God to save me." And a little while after that, an airplane comes over, and they shout down to him through a megaphone, "Here, we're dropping a ladder, climb up." And the man goes, no, I'm not getting in the airplane. I'm waiting for God to save me. Okay, let's make it a seaplane so they can land on the flood. And a little while later, a helicopter comes, says, "Come in, get in, we're trying to save you." And the man goes, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. And so finally the flood engulfs him. The man drowns, and he's at the gates of heaven. He walks in and he meets God for the first time. He says, "God, I was waiting for you. Why didn't you save me in the flood?" God says, "What are you talking about? I said you a boat, a plane, and a helicopter." So that there's that there's that notion that we have a fixed idea of what the holy is, of what God is, of what the sacred is. Right. I mentioned to you when we were discussing doing this talk that there's a Zen koan, the apparently paradoxical statements or stories that you sometimes sit with, and then you have to go see the teacher present your understanding of it, but there's no way you can get a linear or logical understanding of it. And the famous one that everyone knows is, "What's the sound of one hand clapping?" Right? It's obviously absurd, and actually a lot of the koans, there's no way to present them without being silly, So if you're trying to present a serious answer to what is the sound of one hand clapping, forget it. You'll never get anywhere. You have to be willing to be a bit of a fool, to see how to present it.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it like that, but that's the purpose of a koan, right? Is to force you into the position of the fool.
Yeah, exactly. Very much. Yeah. Your ego and your linear, sequential, logical mind is not going to be able to sort out a way to present it. A lot of times you have to be willing in this situation that looks so disciplined, you have to be willing to be silly. If I'd been willing to that day, my first time at the monastery, to go in before the teacher and just reveal myself, tell him the funny story of what just happened and how upset I was, we might have made a connection. The whole thing might have gone a lot more successfully, but instead I was trying to protect myself, so which of course it's all set up where you can't protect yourself. So in Zen, this is a shocking koan to people, but one of the early koans that you have to answer or present properly is, the monk asks the master, like a lot of these begin, "What is Buddha?" And the master says, "Buddha is shit stick." And shit sticks were the corn cobs that they used in the monasteries in the old days, I guess, to wipe their bottoms. They didn't have toilet paper; they used corn cobs. So that's what he's basically saying. Buddha's what you wipe your bottom with. And on the one hand, many people find that shocking. In other religious traditions, it's hard to imagine, pointing to some, great saint of the tradition or prophet of the tradition and saying they're a shit stick. But of course, I gotta love a tradition that'll go that far to point out that everything's sacred. Of course, everything's sacred, isn't it? What we do in the bathroom is sacred. A decaying dead skunk on the side of the road is sacred. What isn't sacred? Everything's sacred. And so oftentimes, especially in the Zen tradition, they'll point to something that a person's sure to think that can't be sacred. That can't be Buddha.
Well, that reminds me of my favorite Nasruddin story.
Oh yeah.
Which is that Nasruddin is at the mosque, and the imam comes in and he finds Nasruddin with his feet up on the altar. And he says, "Nasruddin, what are you doing? Get your feet off the altar. That is a sacred place."
Yes.
And Nasruddin says, "Well, where do you want me to put them?"
Yeah, right. There's no place to put the feet that aren't sacred. Yeah. points to the same thing. Yeah, yeah.
So Sean, what's your favorite joke or koan or funny story?
Well, there's one that I was told when I was doing the research for my One Bird, One Stone that I'm very fond of. It's about this Chinese monk who moved to a small town, very small town in Tennessee in the early 1960s. And, this was a time of repression of Buddhism in China. So there were a handful of Chinese monks who managed to get to Hong Kong. And if you could get to Hong Kong, maybe you could get to the United States. And so this monk did that. His name was Dei Chun. And he somehow lands in this small town in the middle of the Bible Belt, the fundamentalist Bible Belt in Tennessee, right? And he's a monk. He's lived as a monk his whole life. So he lands there just like he would land anywhere in a many times patched yellow monk's robe that's probably 20, 30 years old, a pair of straw sandals that are falling apart. Maybe he's got a straw hat fixed with duct tape, and somebody offers him a cabin because there was a college nearby, and there were a few people there who were interested in Buddhism or were kind of hosting him. So somebody gives him a cabin to live in this village. And you can imagine what an outsider he would have been, 1960s backwoods Tennessee. And if he wants to try and fit into the community, what's he going to do? Knock on the door and say, "Hi, I'm Dei Chun. I'm a Chinese monk." He's standing there in his patch robe. Everybody's going to just think, who is this guy? He's nuts. We just don't even understand what he's about. But anyway, he moves into this cabin, and one day he's standing out in the yard, just enjoying the day, and one of his neighbors walks by and points to this enormous dead oak tree that's in Dei Chun's front yard and says, "You know what, sir? You better cut that tree down, or one of these days we're going to have a storm that's going to blow over and crush your house." And Dei Chun says, "Oh, okay, thank you. I'd take care of it." And he's just learning English, of course. And so the next day he goes to a thrift store and he buys a hatchet. And I picture him buying like one of these little Boy Scout hatchets,
Right.
And the next day he goes to work on this oak tree's enormous trunk with a hatchet, And he starts chopping away, and next day chops away, and next day chops away, and it becomes this thing where he chops away a little bit every day, and he's not making much progress, but it arouses all this curiosity about the neighbors and, from the neighbors, and they start stopping over to see what this crazy fella's doing, chopping away with a hatchet. And one guy comes over with a power saw and says, "Hey, we can cut this thing down in a minute." And Dei Chun says, "No, thank you. No, I do it my way." He chops away with his hatchet. Next day somebody comes with an enormous chainsaw. "Hey, I'll cut this thing down for you." No, I do it my way. So it takes a year, it takes 2 years. Who knows how long it takes for him. But one day, sure enough, he's chopped away for enough day after day after day that the tree finally falls with a enormous crash that shakes all the houses on the street, and all the neighbors come out. By this time, of course, he's become a neighborhood phenomena, cause for conversation, and everybody loves the guy. They'll come out and they see he's actually done it. He's knocked down the tree, and one of the neighbors says, "Well, Dei Chun, what are you going to do now?" And Dei Chun holds up his hatchet and says, "Now I make firewood." Starts chopping away at the fallen tree. So, I just think it's such an obviously nutty way to do things, but that's what broke down all the barriers between him and his neighbors, they all became interested in this crazy guy, came over, started talking to him. Before long, he's part of the neighborhood,
Yeah.
But he later said, when he was asked about it, he said that's the way he was secretly teaching them meditation. You chop away a little bit every single day, and one day an enormous tree falls.
Wow.
And that's exactly the way
Love
meditation works, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can practice for years and feel like, am I getting anywhere? And sure enough, that little hatchet of in the same way water can wear away a canyon over time, our dedicated practice of meditation eventually can fell even this enormous ego, that we carry around. So.
Yeah. And in the meantime, you're just chopping away. I love it how Richard Rohr says it's good for us to practice meditation every day because everybody should have a little bit of failure baked into
Yeah,
your
right,
right.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, there's a tradition in Zen of calling our practice, anyone's practice, one failure after another,
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
life's one long failure. And, I guess a serious person could see that as daunting. But, if you have a little bit of tongue-in-cheek way of looking at the world, doesn't it kind of lighten things up a little bit? It's like, oh, you know, I'm not, it's like my first visit to the monastery. I wasn't there to succeed or impress anyone. I was there to fail. That was the whole point of it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that's the whole thing that drew me into practice. So.
Yeah. And that's part of the comedy too, right? Is we do this thing that we're not going to get an immediate tangible benefit for
Right,
on that
right,
day,
right.
I mean, maybe, it makes your day go better and whatnot, but the
Yeah,
purpose of it is that chipping away, you know?
yeah. There's a well-known koan, not a koan, a haiku poem by a Japanese haiku poet named Isa that speaks to this that I like very much. Haikus being the very short 3-line poems. And Isa is a haiku poet with a sense of humor from the 18th century. And so this haiku is, "O snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly. O snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly." I just think what a lovely way of looking at the world. He's probably out for a walk at the foot of Mount Fuji and he sees a snail crawling along. It's so emblematic of how our human progress goes. You can't, in the
Yeah.
spiritual
Yeah.
life, you can't get anywhere quickly. In the spiritual life, you can't get anywhere quickly. And it's not about
Yeah.
gaining, it's about giving up as much as it is about gaining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Sean, thanks so much for our conversation today. I want to encourage people to take advantage of the opportunity to come see you speak at Zeitgeist on Saturday, February 22nd. And all the information is on our website at zgatl.org. Thanks, Sean. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person. Really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, thank you. We'll do some practice and some laughter, and it should be a good few hours together. Thank you, Debonee.